Are you recording? Alright, hello everyone. Today we will be starting the event of Thursday TEDx, MISx talk, sorry. We will be first starting with Bruce talking about the US politics and the polarization. Let's all give a nice warm round of applause.
Politics and polarization in the US. I'm going to ask you to take a second and think about the year 2020. Some common images come to mind. Months of staring at the four blank walls of your home, the little faces on the computer screen of classmates and colleagues. Empty shops, beaches, trains, and airports. But I'm sure some other images appear. The murder of George Floyd, anti-racism protests all over the US, Donald Trump and maskless rallies. US politics, it seems, took center stage with coronavirus. Last year's politics were significant for one primary reason. They were more polarized than ever. We saw how Black Lives Matter and the alt-right emerged, how people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson entered the limelight, and how Fox anchors became the most watched figures on US media. Why have political tensions surfaced so dramatically? Why are so many aspects of our lives unnecessarily politicized? More importantly, how did we get to be so polarized? To discuss political discourse in the US, we need to start with a centuries-old ideology, American exceptionalism. Only some of you have heard of this before, but its role is crucial. American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States is inherently different from other countries. Most accept that this is because of the unique American values of liberty and democracy. But there's a contradiction. This ideology was present among the colonials in the early 1700s. Liberty, as an idea, appeared later. It was primarily rooted in the lack of strong central government and discovery or seizing of new land by settlers. Afterwards, fear of a European invasion contributed to libertarianism. Liberty thus emerged not as a moral ideal, but a manifestation of multiple circumstantial factors. However, it remained the face of American exceptionalism. Americans claimed they were inherently different because of their liberty. We need to look further back to address the question of American exceptionalism. Once we do so, the answer becomes quite clear. The majority of early settlers in the 1600s and 1700s were Protestant minorities fleeing oppression in Europe, mainly Britain. As they made their way to the new continent, they began to believe that they were on a mission from God. This mission entailed a belief that they would create a shining city upon a hill, a moral beacon for the rest of the world. The discovery of the Americas a few centuries prior sent shockwaves across Europe. However, this idea of mission was born from the prospect that these settlers had found a new country, one free from old oppressors, but first and foremost, one clean of sin. Again, these people were extremely religious folk. This idea was the true basis for American exceptionalism. This meant that settlers believed that their new society was inherently different from the rest of the world due to its moral superiority. Eventually, this was replaced on the surface with liberty. I suppose it was easier to write into the Constitution. But underneath, this was actually the belief in the destiny of the United States, and this carried over from generation to generation. American exceptionalism, the conviction in the special nature of the United States, is a very strong form of nationalism. Nationalism is itself a step up from something like patriotism. While patriotism can be defined as a love for one's country, nationalism is the belief in the superiority of one's country over other nations. This idea very quickly leads to disregard or dislike of anything foreign. Americans were already fearful of British invasion after they declared independence. So American exceptionalism birthed fear of a foreign threat. This soon turned into fear of a divided nation. or a division in what it meant to be American. This is where we're introduced to the culmination of American exceptionalism, which is the identity crisis. While at first it may not seem like it, the success of countries or empires is highly dependent on a common national identity. It's how societies of millions of people can function. Most countries derive this naturally from hundreds of years of common language, heritage, religion, race, and geography. The new American people had none of this, so instead, American exceptionalism was adopted as the national identity. To be American thus meant to be inherently unique, and based off what we discovered before, it also meant to be morally superior to others. As you can probably tell, this did not solve the identity crisis the new American citizens were facing. In fact, all this did was reinforce nationalism. This begins to explain why American exceptionalism is still very visible today. This sense of national identity deriving from American exceptionalism had two major impacts on how politics and political thinking developed in the US. The first is that conservatism is built into the framework of American politics. A nation stuck in perpetual identity crisis will keep looking to its roots for answers and will thus resist progress. Anything that moves away from things that Americans believe are crucial to their thin veil of identity, for example the Constitution, risks exposing the lack of any true national identity. This meant that however progressive the Founding Fathers were for their time, their values would not keep up with rapid liberal changes elsewhere in the 19th century. Constitutional amendments were piecemeal solutions to a political foundation that was becoming, relatively speaking, increasingly conservative as time went on. Indeed, conservatism is the belief in traditions and a reluctance to change, constantly returning to the founding principles of the country and resisting progress are conservatism in action. Anytime legal reforms were too progressive, the backlash from conservative communities led to concessions for these groups. From the Jim Crow laws after the Emancipation Act, or Reagan's reforms after the Civil Rights Act, or the election of Trump after Obama, conservatism has long been pacified, if not encouraged, in American politics. The second impact on political mindset is more direct. The fear of a divided nation, or the definition of what it means to be American, forms a distinct us versus them mentality. This is the claim of Robert Goldberg of the University of Utah. What he's saying is that a people uncertain of their national identity will feel deeply threatened by those who challenge it, and this is a contributor to polarization. The term un-American is a uniquely American word. Americans harbor this suspicion, this betrayal from within. Goldberg here exemplifies the anxiety that comes with uncertainty, that someone will challenge their identity. This anxiousness is directed both towards foreign influences and towards perceived traitors at home. In the late 20th century, American politicians witnessed a unique opportunity. For much of the Cold War, anti-communism revived the anxiety around un-American influences, foreign or domestic. If liberty is the facade of American exceptionalism and the thin veil of identity, then these politicians attempted to introduce something else to the national identity: free market capitalism. And it worked. Americans began to associate themselves with liberty as much as they did capitalism, and again, uncertainty in their true national identity meant they defended it ruthlessly. The shift in rhetoric to the economic right would have widespread impacts, especially for big business. This paradigm shift was spearheaded by the Reagan administration and reinforced when the Cold War ended and the US believed they'd won. The legacy of the Reagan administration had other more serious consequences for political polarization, however. The appeal to disgruntled evangelical conservatives after sweeping anti-racial reforms launched an era where Christian conservatism became tied with government policy. As this extremely powerful voter base became established in its own right, political rhetoric began to tend to the wants and needs of these Christians. Mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and the mishandling of the AIDS crisis were all partially in response to the influence of this community. This was an extension of the usual protection that conservatism is afforded in US politics, but also set in motion a shift rightwards in social policies. So having established the historical and ideological context, it begs the question, why have things escalated recently to create the political atmosphere we see today? Divisive rhetoric in politics operates in a positive feedback loop. where if a voting group responds positively to slogans or ideas presented to them, the party will continue to churn out similar messages. Demand for these increases, and the messages soon grow gradually more radical and begin to push the politics of this group or of the entire country toward an extreme. This has been the case recently with existing right-wing groups, whose prejudices and intolerance have been encouraged, particularly by the Republican Party. It's true that Fox News and the Republican Party now have tapped into a hidden conservatism in many Americans, but the open discussion has pushed them further right. Increased demand for certain political messages correlates surprisingly with increased demand for politicization of daily life. America's cable TV networks have been particularly strategic about harnessing this vulnerability. Another feedback loop opens. Americans turn on their television wanting to watch politics, so networks increase the airtime of politics and sensationalize political events. The demand for politics on TV increases, and so on. Constantly talking about politics has led to networks choosing a stance on political issues, and their political subjectivity grows stronger over time. This is how liberal and conservative media have grown further apart. Moreover, as a deeply patriotic people, Americans respond favorably to symbols of their country. Most news programs make sure to have the American flag situated somewhere in the background, whilst flashing red, white, and blue in studio banners, titles on backdrops, or the ticker at the bottom of the screen. The audiences of cable TV are constantly reminded of the greatness of their country, stoking dangerous nationalism. Increasing the politicization of news is not the only reason as to why media outlets have become left or right-leaning. The primary reason lies in their private ownership. 5 corporations dominate American cable TV, and each have economic ties to the Republican or Democratic parties. Cable TV serves the primary purpose of manufacturing consent to create a political climate favorable to these 5 corporations. Fox News and One American News Network successfully managed to push their audiences socially and economically further right. It's not uncommon to hear Tucker Carlson endorse deregulation and capitalism in an effort to indoctrinate viewers. This certainly does not mean that CNN or MSNBC are exonerated. Don't be fooled by their opposition to Trump and the Republican Party. The divisions across news networks are often to give the impression of diversity, rather than give balanced treatment to subjects. They are all part of the same oligopoly. Social media is another major culprit. The way companies such as Facebook and YouTube generate profit is through algorithms that recommend content similar to content you've already enjoyed. Reddit and 4chan filter users into groups of like-minded individuals. These echo chambers reinforce specific political thought and are quite effective in radicalizing individuals. Indeed, these platforms have become integral to the alt-right, whose recent decentralization has had recruitment move online. This explains how right-wing conspiracy theorists behind movements such as QAnon and Pizzagate have managed to reach a wide audience. In addition, the ease of reaching huge audiences by becoming a content creator has given voices to charismatic speakers, such as Ben Shapiro or PragerU. There are voices on the social and economic left that have been projected by social media, but the nuanced content of conservative channels has been particularly successful. The ingredients for an extremely polarized political landscape were all in place in 2015. All that was needed was a trigger, and that trigger was Donald Trump. Trump empowered Christian conservatives who resented abortion, gun control, and immigration. He empowered emasculated right-wing youths who felt lost in a liberal environment. And he empowered the conservatives whose ideology had been gradually cultivated by social media, news networks, and the fear of the changing landscape they had seen under Obama. The surfacing of this growing political divide only polarized politics further. Deep-rooted conservatism and the stunted political spectrum have long kept policy right of center. This also means that there are only moderate fundamental differences between the Democrats and Republicans, on economic issues at least. Paradoxically, this did not mean less animosity, it meant more. Democrats were labeled as communists. Black Lives Matter protesters were labeled as left-wing anarchists, and liberal activists as perpetrators of tyranny and authoritarianism. Politicians and ordinary citizens were using a wide range of vocabulary to describe two very close ends of a stunted political spectrum. The seemingly empty words are coming from a place of fear of change to what it means to be American, exacerbated by the fact that they're still uncertain of this. The history of political thought in the US certainly created perfect conditions for extreme polarization. The long-winded identity crisis is the most vital condition for the current situation. However, the polarization in recent times has been aggravated by external factors. Why? Because it's profitable. Heated Twitter debates get more clicks. Cluttering political dialogue by focusing on anti-masking instead of climate change benefits big business. Demonizing the political opponent in the two-party system serves as a distraction from the limits placed on democracy. The political polarization we see today is no accident. It is a vulnerability in the American psyche that has been exploited by corporatocracy to distract from the real issues of climate change and rampant free markets. This is the culmination of late capitalism that has let powerful entities control our politics. Our political polarization seems to point to one unavoidable fact, that our current economic system cannot truly coexist with full democracy. So it seems we have a decision on our hands. Thank you.